I'm going to go out on a fairly stable limb here and say that whatever people thought these paddles were going to play like, it probably wasn't this. The carbon TruFoam Genesis paddles hit deceptively hard, have great sweet spots, and premier spin rates that place them in my highest tier of spin that does not rely on the texture of the paddle face. It's very worth noting that I personally confirmed with Carbon that they will be applying their 30-day risk-free trial period with these TruFoam paddles, meaning you can literally order and play with these paddles as much as you want for up to 30 days, and if you decide you don't like your paddle, you can send it back and Carbon will even cover the cost of shipping. With this channel's PBMED discount code, you can buy one of the most anticipated paddles of the last 18 or so months for just about $252. That's a price I was really skeptical of. But if all the evidence I've found and my personal experience so far is pointing us in the right direction, that price is going to buy you a premier paddle that's going to last a really, really long time. I'll take you through my complete dissection of one of these paddles, including a microscopy and comparisons with other foam enhanced paddles, and talk about how this all actually translates into gameplay. But first, let's go over some specs and stats. There are 3 models in the TruFoam Genesis series, the 1, the 2, and the 3, all of which have raw carbon fiber faces with an added layer of fiberglass for power, and come in 14mm thickness with a core that's made of 100% proprietary foam blend, which I'll show a little bit more of in my dissection portion, meaning there is literally zero chance of core crushing like we experienced with Gen 2 and Gen 3 paddles prior to this point. The TruFoam Genesis 1 and the Genesis 3 are both elongated at 16.5 inches long, with the Genesis 1 measuring 16.5 by 7.35 inches with a 5.5 inch handle, and the TruFoam Genesis 3 measuring 16.5 inches long at 7.5 inches wide with a 5.25 inch handle. That means that even though they're both elongated in length, the Genesis 3 has a little more usable hitting surface on the face in both length and width, but the TruFoam Genesis 1 has a longer handle. The Genesis 2 comes in the standard shape at 16 inches long and roughly 7.85 inches wide with a 5.25 inch handle. And for those who've used Carbon's previous 2X Gen 2 paddle, the Genesis 2 has a slightly longer handle and longer overall length in comparison. I'll throw the swing weights and twist weights of the paddles on the screen here, but I do want to touch on a few important things. First off, without getting too lengthy, you should take what you may typically infer about sweet spot size from twist weight numbers and throw it out the window here. Twist weight is most literally a measurement of how much resistance a paddle has to twisting around its vertical axis, and that can sometimes be strongly correlated to sweet spot size. But as you may imagine, a paddle that's made with a higher proportion of foam can likely twist easier around itself than paddles with more heavy material. A lot goes into sweet spot and stability, but foam does seem to add more sweet to the sweet spots of paddles, and as you go from Gen 2 to Gen 3 and Gen 3 to Gen 4, paddles seem to have better sweet spot sizes at relatively lower twist weight numbers. That's certainly the case here, as I found the TruFoams to have great sweet spots, and though this is very subjective, I think the Genesis 2 has the best sweet spot and the most forgiveness of any paddle currently available, a title that was previously held by the Pulse V, which is also saying something extra considering the Pulse V is 16mm thick and the Genesis 2 is 14mm thick. Swing weights are more directly translatable, however, and I do think it illustrates how these paddles felt in the hand. The Genesis 2 with a swing weight of 114 and an overall maneuverability score of 44, 1 being the most maneuverable and 100 being the least maneuverable, felt absolutely perfect for its shape and felt right in that sweet spot of light but not too light. The Genesis 3, however, did feel heavier during use with its higher swing weight of 125 and an overall maneuverability score of 80 that put my model in the top 20% or so of paddle heaviness in terms of perceived weight. And back to the Genesis 1, which had a pretty typical swing weight and maneuverability score for an elongated shape paddle, falling right around average in that shape for both parameters. I did ask around to compare these numbers with other reviewers, and across the board, people were getting very consistent and comparable numbers for their Genesis 2 as I did, but the range of the Genesis 1 and Genesis 3s were a bit wider, and it does seem like I got some of the heavier ones, so take that for whatever it's worth. The spin on these paddles is absolutely fantastic, with the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 coming in as 2 of the top 3 spin rates I've ever recorded, and the 3 trailing not far behind either. Jive speed was also high, with all 3 paddles hitting high speed with full swings and high effort from the baseline. For this next part, I'll go ahead and warn you ahead of time that we're going to get a bit destructive and nerdy, so if you're not into that, feel free to skip forward to the gameplay analysis. As always, a big thank you to the Oracle, Justin Barton, for letting me pick your brain on these things, and another big thank you to my friend Dr. Christy Price for providing today's x-rays. You both rock. After taking off the face, you can see the first legal all-foam core staring back at you. No honeycomb in sight, so core crushing as we know it is literally not possible here. There are some holes added for flexibility on the outside and weight reduction in the middle, and you can see remnants of the adhesion cloth layer inside those face gaps. Contrary to what you might think, the foam core is actually very hard, basically the total opposite of the ripple core, and knocking on it feels like you're knocking on plywood. If you look at x-rays of the paddle, you can see a small square on the paddle face where fiberglass has been added for a little performance boost. And though the work's a bit tedious, I was actually able to whittle underneath that fiberglass layer and pull it right off the back of the face. I wanted to make some direct comparisons between the foam in the TruFoam core to some other paddles, so I gathered some fresh paddles along with some other paddles from my graveyard for comparisons. I bit some chunks out of each of these paddles, and if you look on the screen from right to left, you'll see the foam from the Pickleball Apes Pulse, the 11624 Pegasus Power, the Beta and Production Ripples, a Gearbox PBE, and the Carbon TruFoam. I would characterize the foam from the Pickleball Apes Pulse paddle as more of a crunchy foam, and you can see that on this little piece of paddle here. The 11624 Pegasus Power is certainly more compressible, but not quite to the squishy extent of the next two ripples there. The Gearbox foam is barely compressible, and the Carbon TruFoam is by far the stiffest here and is not compressible at all. I wanted to calculate the density of these different foams, so I used the bandsaw to create some nice flat edges on my pieces so I can measure them well enough for length, width, and height, and then subsequently weigh them. I did a little math to convert my findings to grams per cubic centimeter, and here's what I calculated for density. You should note that these are not likely to be exact considering the imperfect process I took to calculate these numbers, but it's a good start. The Gearbox was way out in front with its high density, followed then by the TruFoam, which was still quite a bit more dense than the Ripples, the 11624 Pegasus Power, and the Pulse. This does give some explanation as to why it wasn't ultra light feeling in my hand like I might have expected an all-foam core paddle to feel like. The look of the TruFoam core under microscope is pretty unique, at least compared to the ones we're looking at today, in that it's got a sort of black eggshell looking appearance. Contrasting that to the ultra dense Gearbox, you can almost feel the extra weight and thickness of the Gearbox foam, which has less air per given area than the TruFoam does. I thought it was also interesting that the three paddles with the closest density, the Beta and Production Ripple, as well as the 11624 Power Paddle, had this sort of cobweb type overtone to them, while the Pulse images look like they do indeed belong to a substance that crunches when you press it. Perhaps the biggest takeaway I had through this, which was surprising to me, was the fact that the dampened feel of the paddle clearly doesn't come from any type of foam compression like I might have thought, and the spin doesn't either. Rather, I think the impression of absorption you get when hitting the ball with the TruFoam comes from the face and core bending and wrapping as a whole, rather than the individual part of the paddle that the ball makes contact with. And bam! We've got a TruFoam dissection. As far as how all these things actually translated into real gameplay, my biggest piece of advice for anyone who tries any of these paddles is to test them over multiple sessions. Carbon has that 30-day use it and still return it policy, so seriously use these over several sessions to test these out because they grew on me every single time I played with them. They have a very unique feel that's quite hard to describe, but they essentially dampen vibrations so well that you don't get very much feedback into your hand to tell you how well you are or aren't hitting the ball. It's a bit of a different feeling to get dialed in on, and I actually did not like these paddles the first time I played with them. I've now gotten to the point that the Genesis 2 is my main go-to paddle, so you can see how far I've come on that front. The strengths of these paddles truly are spin, control, and good power on drives. I predict you'll probably hear a mix of people calling these power or low end of power or all court leaning power, and I think that's because the drive is sneaky high on these. I didn't realize how hard I was actually hitting with these until I started going back and forth between these and some other paddles in back-to-back games. For example, when I switched between the Genesis 1 and the Pickleball Apes Pulse X, or between the Genesis 2 and the Pickleball Apes Pulse V. At that point, it became readily apparent to me that I was hitting much harder with the TruFoams than either of those two Pulse models, and the sweet spots were actually bigger on the TruFoams than those other two paddles as well, which is honestly pretty wild. That effort to power ratio is closer to linear than most Gen 3 paddles, but it still has a bit of an up curve to it, meaning the more effort you put in, it will add just a little bit more proportionate velocity, but it's not wildly exponential like you might expect the Rhombus Ripple or the YOLO 3S to be. As mentioned before, the spin on these paddles was very good, and it relies more on the flex of the foam core and the flex of the face than the grit on the face surface, meaning that spin is going to stay high for a long time too. The best advice I got when testing these paddles was to swing through and trust the spin, and when I started doing that, things really started to take off. But if you thought that these paddles were going to be the absolute monsters of pop levels when you heard they had an all foam core, kind of like I did, then you'd be as wrong as I was. Pop is definitely on the lower side in terms of power paddles, and of the recent paddles I've been testing, these fall right about here in side-to-side pop testing sessions. It's not totally absent, but this lower pop made it so that control was actually really awesome. I could use the spin and the large sweet spot to carve out points at the net, and I hit drops with seriously good shape and precision. For the specific paddles, the Genesis 2 has the largest sweet spot, is the lightest of the three paddles, and I felt like I could hit it plenty hard with harder swings. The Genesis 1 was certainly a step up in power, but a step down in sweet spot size compared to the Genesis 2. It was a little heavier as well, but I did think it felt very manageable and probably about average for what you see in typical elongated shaped paddles in terms of weight. The Genesis 3 definitely hit the hardest, but it also crossed that barrier for me of being a bit too head heavy, so I did not like it as much as the Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and I steered more in the direction of those other paddles. On perhaps one of the most important things to talk about with these paddles, with the many sessions I've played with them, I have found absolutely no issues with durability or changes in performance over time. It took only 1 or 2 sessions to soften the face a little bit so it absorbed the ball better, and after that it never got hotter, and I've been able to play consistently with a paddle I knew was going to be the same every time I picked it up, which is a huge sigh of relief for me and has addressed a huge hole in the paddle market right now. Touching on some quick comparisons people are likely going to want to know about, the Rhombus Ripple is by far more poppy and hard hitting than the TruFoams, but control is really so much better with the TruFoams, and the sweet spots are slightly larger on the TruFoam models, and the durability seems elite with the TruFoams, while that's still a question mark on the production level Ripples. The paddles in the 11.624 Power Series are also a bit more poppy than the TruFoams, landing somewhere in between the Ripple and the TruFoam for pop levels. They also seem to be incredibly durable over many hours of testing as well, but the spin and control is a lot higher on the TruFoams, and the sweet spots are much larger on the TruFoams as well. The TruFoams hit harder than the new Gen 3 Honolulu paddles, but the feel of the face here is the largest difference, as the paddles in both of these series have huge sweet spots, while the TruFoams have more of a uniformed, dampened feel to them, and the Gen 3 Honolulus have a very grab and throw, floaty type feel with their floating core. Overall, I think the TruFoam Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are real home runs, while my TruFoam Genesis 3 crossed that weight line and became a little too head heavy for my preference, and probably the preference of most people as well. The Genesis 2 is my ultimate favorite. It's become my main paddle, and it has the largest sweet spot of any paddle that I've ever used. These are going to be great paddles for people who want high spin rates, great sweet spot sizes, a great deal of control with high velocity on harder swings, and for those who are sick of paddles that have big break-ins or breakdowns over time. These are not going to wow you in terms of their pop level, so if you want high levels of that, these are probably not going to be the paddles you want. And that's my take on the long-awaited carbon TruFoams. I hope the review was helpful. Let me know if you have any comments or questions in the comments below this video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you here for the next one.